Okay.
Do I need to stand in a particular spot?
You can do anything. I'll just follow you around. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Good to be here. I understand that you forced against your will to read my book. That's very kind of your professor, kind of a raw deal for you, but I'm glad people are reading it. Let me tell you a little bit about who I am, and then I'll share a few ideas that will sound familiar because they're certainly ideas that can be found in the book. But then I really would like to turn it into a discussion. I actually feel a little awkward talking about ideas when I know that you've been assigned to read the book. So I'd like to turn it into a discussion pretty quickly. But you know, as if you made it through the first chapter, you realize that I'm the son of dairy farmers, and I grew up in Clark County, about halfway between Eau Claire and Wausau. And you know, that experience, that upbringing, shaped me and shaped my politics to an extent that's actually kind of scary. Because when I left the farm, I haven't lived on the farm ever since, and yet it still has a huge impact on how I think about the world, and it does shape my politics to this day. And you know, of course, then who you grow up around have big impacts on what you become and who you are as well. And for me, I came along kind of late. I was the last child born in our family. My parents were about 40 years old when I came along, so they were Depression children. They grew up in the Great Depression, and that, of course, shaped them. And my dad worshipped FDR. Franklin Roosevelt was the political figure that he then judged everybody by. Every candidate he ever voted for the rest of his life, he thought about how much do they resemble Franklin Roosevelt. And of course that then had an effect on how I looked at the world and how I thought about politics. And you know, all these factors ended up leading me to a life in the nonprofit sector in particular, as a political activist. And I spent 15 years tracking money in politics and fighting for campaign finance reform and working to make changes that would make our democracy healthier. I got to 2013 or 2014 and started looking myself in the mirror. And I loved that job as director of the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. It was the best job I ever had. But I kind of looked myself in the mirror and asked whether doing that job for another 15 years would get us to a better place, if that alone would be game-changing enough. And my conclusion was no, it wouldn't. So I decided to start this. I wrote the book first, and based on the response that I got to the book, we've just started this new undertaking called Blue Jean Nation. What this really is it's not a party, it's a movement in the making, and it's aimed at trying to put into operation the ideas in the book. I wrote the book not as an academic exercise, because I'm no academic. I really wrote it as a blueprint. And blueprints, of course, are useless unless you build something with them. And this is that something. This is the outgrowth of the book. And it was actually just publicly announced on Monday. And we started to, you know, just become a public presence. And so now I am, for the time being, the unpaid founder and president of Blue Jean Nation, and have left behind my work at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign. I really did this, and I wrote the book because I've reached a point in my life where I'm having a really hard time recognizing my state. I grew up here, born and raised here in Wisconsin, and I knew a state that had political traditions and had certain ways of doing things that have disappeared. And I look at Wisconsin sometimes and I have a hard time even recognizing this as the place I grew up in. Our state has changed so much politically. And I'm distressed by what my state is becoming, and so I decided we gotta do something to see if we can't get citizens back in the driver's seat of our government at a time when both major parties are failing us. And you know, I understand that at your age, you may think that it's sort of always been the way it is now. That the way politics works has to be the way politics has always been. And the way Wisconsin is today is the way Wisconsin always has been. One of the reasons I wrote the book was sort of as a reminder that things have not always been this way politically in our state. Wisconsin has not always been like it is today. And that actually, from time to time, citizens take matters into their own hands and make massive landscape-altering change. And it's, at your age, it's totally understandable and predictable to have the feeling like, well, but this is just the way things are and it's not going to change. And if you look at the condition of our political system today, the problems seem so intractable. It just seems so fouled up that it's hard to imagine getting out of the rut that we're in. And I really wrote the book in hopes that people could become well acquainted with the fact that previous generations were in ruts every bit as deep as the one we're in and found a way out. And what fascinated me as I looked at not only politics over the course of my lifetime, but then as I read history, it was fascinating how every single time real change has come to our country politically, it hasn't come from political establishment types. It has not come from the major political parties. It has not come from established leaders of the major parties. It hasn't come from Washington. It hasn't come from Madison. It's come from plain people. It's been citizen-driven every single time. And the other thing that fascinated me is every single time citizens were imaginative. And they realized the importance of getting rid of old labels and old ways of thinking and talking and inventing new political vocabulary, inventing new identities, and coming up with sort of a new brand, to use an economic term, sort of rebranding themselves and using that brand then to drive change. And I think we're at a moment that cries out for that sort of political imagination because we are really stale politically. We're stale in our thinking, and we desperately need to become creative again. Well, one of the things that I point out in the book, you probably have encountered, but I'll touch on it briefly here, is how we've been conditioned or brainwashed to think and talk about politics in ways that divide people who could and should be united and sort of turn ourselves into active participants in our own disempowerment. And that is what is so deeply frustrating to me, is that every day I encounter people who, by force of habit, think and talk in ways that separate themselves from people who could and should be their allies, and they think and talk in ways that end up being polarizing and end up ultimately being destructive, and that disempower them because they desperately need a lot of the people who they see as enemies. They need them because they have a lot of common interests, a lot of shared concerns, and they need to be together, but they're driven apart. And they're driven apart for really pretty silly reasons. One great example, and before I say this, let me say that I actually choose the label commoner. You'll see, Blue Jean Nations, we identify as commoners. That is a practical outgrowth of that chapter called thinking vertically. We've been trained to think horizontally, about who's on the left and who's on the right, who's liberal, who's conservative. And what I'm suggesting is that if you flip the spectrum up on its head and think vertically instead of horizontally, and think about who's on top and who's on the bottom, who are the royals of American politics and who are the commoners, it opens up opportunities to unite people who currently do see themselves as enemies and who are currently divided. And so I choose to call myself a commoner. There are reasons for that. First of all, I've grown tired of people saying, well, are you a liberal or are you a conservative? The truth is I'm a mutt, like most normal people. Normal people are mutts. They are not purebreds. Normal people are not 100% liberal or 100% conservative. The truth is that we're complicated, and we've got a whole mixture of values and beliefs. And about some things you might be on the conservative side, on some things you might be really liberal, on some things you might be middle of the road. When it comes to personal finance, or the way I used to run the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, I was incredibly conservative. In personal finance, I am a conservative. There are things that I'm liberal about. So I'm a mutt, like most normal people. Only in the political world are people trying to pass themselves off as purebreds and say that they're completely liberal or completely conservative. So I just got tired of people saying, well, you're a liberal. Because I'm a mutt, is what I am. And that's what most normal people are. So I choose the label commoner. The reason I choose it is because, first of all, I'm the son of dairy farmers, and I don't know what else you could be but a commoner if you're a son of dairy farmers. But then also, it's a term for me that speaks to values. I believe that common sense should be a hell of a lot less uncommon in government. It seems to have almost taken a permanent vacation from Congress. And they can't work together on anything. They can't allow common sense to prevail on anything. And then I think concern for the common good ought to be far less uncommon than it is. We've been sort of preached at and lectured about for years now that you're on your own. Look out for number one. Don't care about, you're actually in competition with everybody else. And we've lost this sense that I grew up with out on the farm, that you got to look out for each other. I wrote about that man, Les Sturz, who lost his father to suicide and was still helping his neighbors. That's what we were taught to do, is you looked out for each other. And that has been lost. And I think we've got to get it back. So that concern for the common good is a value that is really important to me. All of that leads me to call myself a commoner. But that also is part about rejecting labels that imprison us. You take the words liberal and conservative. Liberal comes from a Latin word. That Latin word is also the root for the word liberty. So the word liberal means freedom. But when you listen to people who self-describe as conservatives, they say that they're the pro-liberty ones. And they think that liberals are anti-freedom. You hear that all the time. About how conservatives are for freedom, for liberty, and that the liberals are anti-freedom. Now that's weird. The word liberal comes from the same root as the word liberty, and yet its meaning, its connotation has been changed over time so that the conservatives see themselves as the pro-liberty ones. And then you have the people who call themselves conservatives. That word comes from the same root as the words conserve and conservation. And the liberals among us think that the conservatives are anti-conservation. They go to their party convention and they say, drill baby drill. They want to burn every drop of oil on the face of the earth. And so the liberals say that they're for conserving and for conservation, and that the conservatives are anti-conservation. Now, this is weird territory that we're in. These words, their meaning has changed so much that they've become virtually irrelevant for current use. So I don't know what you all describe yourselves as. If you think of yourself, self-identify as a liberal or a conservative or something else, all I can say is that those words don't mean what they used to mean. And those words don't even mean what today's dictionaries say that they mean. You can look the word up, and yet that's not the meaning that they have in the actual political world. And that's something that we've got to come to terms with. We are constantly dealing with labels that have taken on connotation. I grew up in rural Wisconsin. If you go out to Clark County today and you tell somebody that you are a Democrat or that you are a progressive, that means something to them. That's code to them. What it means in Clark County is elitism, arrogance, condescension. When they hear the word liberal or progressive or Democrat, they think these are people who think that they know more than we know, that they think we're voting against our own interests, are too stupid to know the difference. They think that they could run our lives better than we can run our lives. They think of arrogance and condescension, and they think of elitism. That's what those words mean. So people who self-describe as liberals or Democrats or conservatives, they're carrying baggage that maybe they don't even deserve to carry. Maybe if you're a liberal and you go out to Clark County, maybe you don't actually carry any of those behaviors with you. Maybe you don't treat people that way, but that's the baggage that is loaded on you anyway. And similarly, the word conservative in many places also has meaning, and it is about greed and self-absorption. And it also, that word has taken on connotation. And what I'm suggesting is that maybe it's time for us to start to shed some of that baggage. Because it's baggage that none of you created. None of you participated in the development of all that connotation that has been loaded onto those words. But you inherit that baggage if you accept the word, if you accept the label. You also then inherit the baggage. And I think we're at a moment where our political system is busted. It's one of those historic moments where the ranks of the politically homeless are large. I just saw the other day, Pew Research said that it's been 3/4 of a century since this large a percentage of Americans couldn't bring themselves to identify as either Democrats or Republicans. I actually cited earlier Pew Research that said pretty much the same thing in my book, but the latest Pew poll says exactly the same thing. It's at least 3/4 of a century since this many people refuse to say whether they're a Democrat or Republican. And I think most people are feeling like the system's not working. Their voices are not being heard. Their votes aren't mattering for much. Their interests are not being represented. We're at a moment where the political system is failing us, where the major parties are failing us. I would even suggest that language is failing us. The words we choose to use, the labels we accept, all of that's failing us. So to me, this is a moment that cries out for innovation. It cries out for reinvention. And the cool thing is that past generations actually had the wisdom to do this before, where they would shed labels, they would discard old vocabulary, they would come up with something that sort of makes sense for them. And that had a magical effect. It ended up driving political change. The fascinating thing to me is that the way we talk about politics, the way we choose to talk to one another, can have revolutionary impact. And it can end up influencing policy, it can end up influencing so much just by the words we choose to use. And so I wrote this book really in hopes of encouraging people to break out of old habits and to start innovating when it comes to political language. The last thing I'll say before we open it up to conversation is just a word about why I chose to call the book Blue Jeans in High Places and why this group is called Blue Jean Nation. You probably kind of gather the gist of it from reading the book. But I just wanted to share one admission. I started thinking some time ago, probably back to 2011 or 2012, I started thinking, you know, language is failing us, words are failing us, all these labels are failing us. So I started experimenting with audiences. I get a chance to do a lot of public speaking with all kinds of different groups of every age, in rural communities and in our largest cities. And so I got a chance to talk to a lot of audiences, and I started trying labels out on them. And I confess that for the longest time, I stuck to animals. Because we have a donkey and an elephant as the symbols of our major political parties. And so I was trying to find an animal that would somehow unite people or that would resonate with people. And it took me quite a few months before I realized that a search for a new political animal was useless. Well, then I realized, I looked at countries like Ukraine and Yugoslavia, and when they had political revolutions, in one of the countries it was called the Orange Revolution, and another was called the Bulldozer Revolution. The color orange became the symbol of the people's movement. Simply the color orange. And when people wore orange, that meant that you were part of this uprising. And in another one of the countries, the bulldozer, a piece of machinery, became the symbol of the people's uprising. And so I realized, why do we even have the donkey and the elephant as symbols of our major political parties? And as I mentioned in the book, it dates all the way back to the 19th century, and the same political cartoonist, Thomas Nast, gave both parties their symbol. So then I started toying with other ideas, and blue jeans happened to be the one that consistently seemed to find common appeal with vastly different audiences. Young or old, rural or urban, people, blue jeans symbolize something. They're ubiquitous in America, obviously, but they sort of are the symbol of plain people. It's sort of a working class kind of an image. It sort of expresses, it's almost like the fashion equivalent of democracy. It's like a fashion metaphor for democracy. And people connect to it. And it was the one thing, the one symbol, or that people all seemed to feel comfortable with. Everything else I tried, and I mean everything else I tried, would work one place but not another. It would work with one person but somebody else was uncomfortable with it. It was fascinating. And it really did date back to a speech I gave to a group of farmers. 250 farmers I was speaking to in Wisconsin Rapids. And I asked them how many of them owned a donkey. And not a single hand went up. And I thought, come on, somebody's still got to have a donkey on their land somewhere. Nobody did. And I thought, even out on the farm, donkeys have no relationship to modern life. They have no relevance. They serve no useful purpose in American life anymore. And of course, I asked them if anybody owned an elephant, and nobody did. And then I asked them how many people own a pair of blue jeans, and every single person raised their hand. And the response I got from that is part of what inspired the name of this group and the name of the book. I really don't care what we end up uniting around as far as a new identity and new ways of labeling ourselves. What I can tell you is that labels matter. Symbols matter. They have a huge impact on our politics and ultimately on our government. And I think sometimes people get so educated and so smart, and they dive so deeply into the intricacies of policy and so deeply into the minutiae of issues that they forget that really simple symbolism and basic metaphor has enormous power to move people in politics. And we're stuck with 19th century labels and metaphors and symbols. and this is the freaking 21st century. And I think that's holding us back. And I think we've got to simplify our thinking and get back to basics and think in terms of symbols and labels that would speak to us in the 21st century and that can help unite us in the 21st century. So let me stop there. Some additional thoughts that I hope build on what you might have encountered in the book. But what I really would like to do is give you an opportunity to ask any questions you have, offer any criticisms that you have, share any thoughts that you want to share. So it's your turn. Yeah.
Yeah. So Wednesday we were talking a little bit about the political party system, and we talked about how there's majority two parties, Republican and Democrat.